There have been some debates and discussions about whether abortion should be legalised, decriminalised. Certainly discussions along those lines have been going on in New South Wales. So the question is, what should laws cover? Are there some things that it's appropriate for laws to cover and some things that should be outside of the law? What can the law do for us in this kind of area? Should we be concerned about that? Well, what can the law do and what should we be concerned about the law covering for us? It's a complicated issue, and unpacking that complicated issue and making it crystal clear, the Dean of Sydney, Phillip Jensen.
Hello, Kel.
Let's start with the law, because we sometimes have really high expectations that if we've got the right laws covering the right things, everything will be okay. But there are a lot of things the law can't do, aren't there? There are limitations.
Yeah, there are great limitations to the law, and there are false expectations. Law is a wonderful thing. To live in a society ruled by law is to live in a safe place, a secure place, a reliable, dependable place. The very concept that the law stands publicly gazetted and all citizens are called to account to it, and it's a wonderful way to live. But the law has taken on to itself something of an absolute. So some people confuse the law with morality. And so that's a really sad confusion. They expect that what the law says is right, and what it says is... Whereas laws need changing from time to time because sometimes they're wrong.
And laws don't actually always change society, because they don't change human beings, they don't change the human heart.
No, they can never change the human heart. That's one. Every treasurer has wanted a law that will change the human heart on tax paying.
Yes.
And all they do is get bigger and bigger tax laws because knowing the rules and regulations don't change. God's law didn't change the hearts of God's people.
It just said, here's what I expect of you and here's what I expect you not to do, but didn't change them inside.
No, can't change. And so law itself does not change people, and to that extent, therefore, can't change society. And so you can pass the most Christian laws ever in the history of mankind and still have a completely non-Christian society.
I mean, I've been on lots of roads where the speed sign said in big lettering, 60k, and people went flying, most of the traffic went flying past me at 80 on the assumption the law didn't apply to them.
Yes, that's right.
But Christians sometimes think we should try to make the laws of our society as Christian as possible, because that would be a good thing.
Yes. In some ways, it's right to be thinking that way. That is, the law of the Old Testament, for example, that God gave to Israel was specific for that period in time and for that history, for that theocratic society, which modern Australia or modern America, modern any other country is not. The kingdom of God is eternal and is for the world to come. It's not for now in that sense. We're not to institute the laws of Israel into our world. But those laws did reflect the character of God, the values of God, the attitudes that mattered. So,
and they're not just law, they're guidance, they're sort of wisdom.
Yes.
This really is the best way to live.
It is the best way to live. So you take little laws like you should not muzzle the ox while it treads out the grain, is a way of saying that people deserve to be paid for their labour, that it's a right thing. You shouldn't stop people being paid for their labour. There are laws of putting parapets around your roof, which are, again, in principle, the idea that the person who owns the house has responsibility for the safety of those who go up on the roof, and to which we've just instituted laws recently in the last few years about tilers having to have harnesses and put up balustrades to protect people when they're working on our roofs. And so many of the values that you can find in the law really are the best way to live. The wisest way, the fairest way, the just way. They're God's ways to live.
But if we can't persuade our society of that, our society won't adopt them, will it?
No. So polygamy is a dreadful law. Right? To be against polygamy is right, because polygamy always degrades women. It always makes two standards of humanity. It always is to the disadvantage and detriment of wife number two and for the children of number two. There's no good thing about polygamy, really, but yet we are being pressed in our society to accept polygamy now. Now, it's God's law that protected us from that, and only God's law, frankly, because down the centuries, across civilization, people have been polygamous. It's Christianity that brought monogamy as the marital method into our society. And as we move away from Christianity, so the pressure comes back into having polygamy.
Does it matter if the laws of our society are, over the course of a generation or so, becoming less biblical, less Christian, and moving in another direction? I mean, is that, if there's a trend like that, is that just old people getting grumpy and saying, "Oh, it was better when I was younger," or is it a bad thing for our society if that happens?
It's a bad thing for our society because Christian laws are better laws in the long run. But yes, in lots of ways. Raising my children in their generation, they were born in the 70s, so I raised them in the 80s and 90s, was considerably harder than being raised myself in the 40s and 50s and 60s, because of the peer group pressure upon them to immorality and decadence, because of the pressure on drugs. It's a simple, obvious, tangible thing. In the 60s, as I came to the end of my teenage years, some of my friends were beginning to use marijuana. By the time my children were at the end of primary school, they are being pressed in the playground with hard drugs. That's a big difference.
Yeah,
now.
okay.
My grandchildren being raised now, it's an even more dangerous.
So for those Christians who choose to fight that battle and try to argue for Christian laws, it's worth doing.
Well, yes, it is worth doing, right? It's not going to Christianise the society because they can't change the human hearts by law.
But it will make it a wiser or better place in which to live.
A better place to live in this lifetime and in this world. That's where, and a fairer one for people. Gambling never helps people. It is always detrimental to our society, and it helps poor people least of all. But have I got a double negative there? It's worse for poor people. But our society accepted casinos and gambling and off-course gambling in the late 80s, early 90s, I can't remember which. Now that has been to the detriment of our society.
When there's a TAB in every suburb, it's a different world,
It's a different world
to the time when there was none.
That's right. And it's in all the school P&Cs. I mean, there can be no rejection. No one's allowed to stand up these days and say gambling's evil, we shouldn't be doing this.
Right.
Even though our society and our parliamentarians are corrupted by gambling, even though poor people are destroyed by it. I mean, the casino sends out buses to give free trips to people from the poor parts of Sydney to come in and spend money and spend their pensions in the casino. I mean, it's just dreadful what is being done. So it's of no benefit to us as a society. But when we had laws against gambling, they were never prosecuted.
Right.
Well, they were, but they weren't. They couldn't be.
Yes.
Gambling is too widespread, fundamental an activity of our community for a law to work.
What that actually says is that our society is not just governed by laws.
No.
It's governed by laws and a whole lot of other things.
That's right.
So driving out gambling is impossible.
That's right. The society is not governed by government.
Right. It's governed by human beings.
Well,
in a
that's
mass,
true.
I suppose.
But there's hundreds of activities in society that got nothing to do with government.
Right.
There's no government regulation on our conversation that is happening here at the moment.
No.
There's no government regulation about the colour of the walls that we can paint things. There's no government. There's a whole host of things. I'm glad there's none, I may say. The government's range is a very narrow range. And so there's hosts of human activities that are and should be outside the range of government. So we're not governed by government in everything. They have their little thing. Our culture governs our behaviour, our heritage.
Right.
And so the way in which Australians live is different to the way in which Americans live. It's different to the way Nigerians live because of our history as much as anything else. The New Zealanders are better educated than the Australians.
I didn't know that.
Well, that's obvious. A New Zealander would.
Right. You've made your point. Thank you.
It's got to do with the heritage of where New Zealand settlement came from in terms of the Scots and the clearances and so on, as opposed to us with the Irish traditions and the Cockney and Yorkshire traditions.
Yep.
So our heritage has created the kind of culture we're in.
That means that sometimes when things cease to be covered by law, it's because people are saying it shouldn't be covered by law. It should be so they might say abortion or homosexual activity or pornography or,
Adultery used to be covered by law.
Yes.
But it's no longer covered by
So
law.
they say there shouldn't be a law about these things.
Yes.
These are those parts of human behaviour that law should not apply to.
Yes.
How do we know what it should apply to and what it shouldn't?
Well, in one sense, we don't, and it doesn't matter. That is, the Bible never assumes we're in government. The Bible writes to us as people who are citizens, even oppressed and persecuted citizens, and calls upon us to obey the government, whatever the government is of the day.
And Paul was saying that when there was a dictatorial Roman Empire.
Exactly, an awful government.
Right.
But on the other hand, it says that the role and rule of government is for justice. Now, justice is a fairly elastic term. I mean, there's economic justice, a fair distribution of money. That's a justice issue. Likewise, there's criminality like theft or murder. That's a justice issue. Well, what about an issue like Sunday trading? Is that a justice issue? Yes and no. That the community has a day off is a matter of justice and fairness and kindness and generosity.
And it can even help if the community has a common day off, can't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's dreadful when there's no common day off, because although you can say, well, the society runs 7 days a week and different people can have different days, different families can have different days. Little people, poor people, can't choose which day they have off.
Yeah, so they never see the rest of the family.
That's right. It's always for the rich. The shareholders, they take the weekend off.
Yes.
The bosses, they're off playing golf or lying on the beach, but the actual workers, they've got to go when they're told to go. And you can bribe them and corrupt them by offering them double time or triple time and the rest, but by paying them such poor salaries that they've got to work double time and triple time in order to live, you're really giving them no choice.
So the absence of a common day off is an attack on family life, in a sense.
Attack on, yes, the family life or the quality of life. Yeah, it could be Thursday. It's not got to do necessarily with Sunday and Christian religious observances. That you have a day off every week is an important principle of caring for the quality of life of the community. Without a day off every week, you're saying materialism is what rules the community. And a society that's ruled by materialism is a society ruled by greed, and greed has got us into a fairly big global financial meltdown right now.
Yes, yes.
It's interesting to see the Marxists, they wanted us to work 10 days a week.
Right. They wanted a 10-day week.
Yes.
Yes.
That was their thing. The capitalists have given it to us. And our Labor government is actually worked as the maternity nurse, bringing it into existence.
Right, right.
Now, what have all these three, the Marxists, the capitalists and the socialists, got in common? They're all materialists.
Right.
They're not actually humanitarians. They're not concerned for the good and welfare of the community or for individual families or for us having anything in life other than materialism.
Yes. It's the acquire as much as you can. That's what life is all about.
Yes.
Philosophy,
That's
which
right.
we talked about on this program.
That's right.
Yeah.
So 20% of shopping takes place now on a Sunday.
Really? I had no idea it was as
It's
high as that.
astonishing, isn't it?
That's huge.
And of course,
Yes.
it's a complete fudge, because if every day was like the same, then you wouldn't have a Sunday in which 20% could get their
Yes,
shopping done
yes,
then.
yeah.
And they even do stupid spin doctoring, like they're saying things like, it's the time when the family can shop together.
Well, the people who are working in the shops can't have their family shopping with them, can they?
Exactly.
Okay.
It's a nonsense.
So when these things are decriminalised, Sunday trading or more significant things like abortion, the one that I mentioned at the beginning, or homosexual activity or pornography or polygamy or whatever, what does decriminalising do? I mean, it's not just a case of there are two categories, these things are criminal, these are... It's a big change when that change happens and
Yes,
something is
that's right.
decriminalised.
Decriminalise seems to me to be a bit of a spin doctor word too, because you can decriminalise things that we've never actually put anybody in prison for.
Right.
Criminalising it makes it sound like this is a prison sentence. Now, you can say parking illegally is a criminal activity, because if you keep parking illegally long enough and you don't pay your fines often enough, you will wind up in prison.
Eventually.
Eventually.
Yes.
But no one perceives illegal parking as criminal, because criminal sounds like theft.
So there's a difference in criminal and illegal.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
And we need to see the difference. We don't want to prosecute and persecute, imprison everybody who is acting contrary to the good of society, that would become a very tyrannical state. That would be an awful state. A certain degree of freedom for people is really an important quality of life for us as a society, and keeping government out of people's private lives as much as possible is a good thing too. But by decriminalising something, it often means removing it from the legislation completely and therefore socially approving of it. And that's a different thing than not locking up people for it.
So that's changing the whole category in which we're meant to think about it.
Yeah, that's right. And when the government says, well, we don't care if you do it or not, then it's no longer wrong to do it. If it's no longer wrong to do it, then it can be taught in the public schools.
Right. So,
taught to children. You can teach children how to gamble. You can run classes on how to gamble. Because gambling is not illegal. It's not just that it's kind of no longer criminal, it's now approved.
Yes.
Well, we must be able to express the disapproval of society while still leaving people free to do that which we disapprove of. There's got to be that other category there somewhere. So prostitution is something we disapprove of. We should disapprove of. It's only bad for prostitutes. It's a dreadful way of life for them.
Yes, they're being exploited, aren't they?
They're being exploited. It is a form of slavery. Always has been, always will be. We hate slavery. It's a slavery. It's a dreadful thing to bring women into prostitution. It doesn't help men as a society. It doesn't resolve their problems. There's no good news about prostitution, and it always goes with criminality as well. We've legalised prostitution. Well, no, we should keep it as illegal but not prosecute it.
Right. So we need to be realistic about having this other category where we acknowledge that this is against the law, but so that means the law is playing an educational role?
Yes, it does. A constraining and educational role. It sets a framework for society and says these are the kinds of taboos, too strong a word, but these are the kinds of structures of our society. This is the kind of moral framework of our society as it functions. Now, within that, there are certain things you do them, the police will come around and lock you up. But there are other things which we don't like, we don't want you to do. As a society, we don't think it's good, therefore we're not going to give tax relief for it, we're not going to encourage it, we won't allow you to advertise it, you can't teach it in the schools, but we're not going to lock you up in prison for it.
Yes. So, for this activity, whatever it happens to be, there's no jail term, but you can't ever promote it.
Yes.
You can't flaunt it, you can't advocate it for other people.
Yeah. So you wonder, you've got this, smoking is a good illustration. It's not illegal to smoke. We're not going to put you in prison for smoking. We're not going to put people who make tobacco products in prison for making tobacco products. But we don't want people to smoke. We don't want it taught in schools as a good and proper thing. We don't want it encouraged. We don't want it advertised.
Well, in that case, we have found that sort of third way because we've made so many places where it's not legal to smoke,
yes,
where you can be fined for smoking or whatever,
yes,
that we've got the message across that we're not going to lock you up for smoking, but we don't like it and we don't approve of it. We've managed to achieve that, haven't we?
We have on smoking, and there's a shame level in it. I feel sorry for the people as I walk around the streets of Sydney who are taking their smoke outside.
Yes.
Because they look like lepers. They've got to stand down there, cut off from the rest of society, puffing furiously. Yeah, they are the victims. They're the addicts. They've been addicted. They've been sold a puff. They've been brought into this terrible biological, chemical addiction. And so you can feel sorry for them. But there's a certain sense in which now it is a shameful thing to do. When you and I were young men, it was a glamorous thing to do.
Yes, and everyone in the movies did it, and you became sophisticated and adult doing it.
That's right. And this decriminalisation argument is a silly one because, you see, we criminalised, or the Americans criminalised, alcohol consumption and had prohibition. It was a law that could not work. And so now we have open slather advertising of it and promotion of it. And you've got a culture of binge drinking where the government is now facing the kind of problems it had with smoking previously. And they're having to grapple with the need to create laws that will restrict alcohol promotion, alcohol consumption, without making it something that you're going to get locked up as for the prohibition days. And there's lots of law that should be clearly established, which are not matters that you're going to lock someone up for. Although, if you persist in rejecting the law, fighting against it, won't pay fines, won't do what they say, well, you will get locked up. And I suppose if you smoke in government buildings and refuse to put it out and refuse to leave,
you could be fined.
You could be fined. If you refuse to pay the fine, I guess you could be locked up.
Eventually.
Eventually.
Yes.
But that's not the aim of what we're trying to do with the law.
So we need laws which are criminal offences, things which are not criminal but illegal, and that range of things which the law doesn't address and doesn't talk about.
Yeah.
Once we understand that, how do we as Christians respond? I mean, are there things we need to obey the law, you were saying, but can we do more than that? If we're worried about something, do we write to our Member of Parliament? Do we support people who are wanting this law changed or that law not changed?
Well,
how do we respond Christianly?
it's difficult. We're in a democracy, and we Christians in this democracy are in a minority. Mind you, a key part of this democracy and why it is a democracy and how we live with the freedoms we have is because we are the bearers of the Christian heritage that has given it to us. And if we just let go that heritage and ignore it and allow the majority to rule, the weakness of democracy is the majority will not necessarily rule justly and with righteousness. There's always the tyranny of the majority. If you're in a minority, you never get what you want in a democracy, and it's unjust.
So we're the bearers of the heritage which has given us the best things in our society.
Yes, and we shouldn't be embarrassed about saying it, and we should remind people that that's actually where it's come from. However, we can't expect governments to rule Christianly in a democracy where we are in the minority. We need to educate our citizenry, we need to educate the government so that the governments will make good decisions. As a minority, our first priority is to preach the gospel of Jesus and to teach righteousness and judgment to come. But
because that changes people's hearts.
That changes their hearts. And that
presumably the more hearts that are changed, the more society changes.
Yes, that's right. Whereas if we try and impose the change from outside without changing the hearts, we will only get ourselves into tyranny and into conflict.
So we stick to our gospel task as our main task, but we can't just ignore the laws and let everyone who's not Christian...
If we weren't in a democracy, we would ignore the law. We wouldn't ignore the laws, we'd obey the laws, but we wouldn't even contemplate trying to change them.
Right. But we're in a democracy.
Because we're in a democracy, we have that freedom.
Right.
However, being in a democracy that has been white-anted by antagonism to Christianity, being in a democracy that is controlled and run by materialists, we don't often get listened to. In some ways, we get listened to more than you would expect. That is, there are more Christians in Parliament than the population would give you expectation of. That has to do with the fact that Christians are people who are concerned for the welfare of society and are willing to enter into public service. But the parliamentary process has been severely compromised by the power of money necessary to get elected.
Mind you, I was talking to a friend who has been involved in education and campaigning to make sure euthanasia is never legalised. And she was saying one of the things they need to do is not go and say, here are good Christian reasons for not legalising it, but because it is wise, there are good other reasons that even a materialist can recognise. You know, there will be old people in our society who will be killed unwillingly if you bring this in.
Yes, not a materialist. The real going materialist won't recognise anything that's not got a profit motive.
Right.
But the utilitarian can recognise that, yes, this is good for society, and intuitively people will recognise, yeah, that's right, that's fair. So you can argue with people without reference to God about the values that God has taught us, because they will be the best for society. It is not good for society for people to work 7 days a week. It's just not good for society. It's not good for family life. Family life is good for society. But if the government is owned and controlled by banks, by brewers, by casinos, by the big end of town shopping people, they're not going to listen to what's wise.
So there's no argument we can offer them to say this is a bad thing to do, because all we're talking about is what happens to families. What they're talking about.
Corrupt societies give you corrupt governments,
right,
and corrupt governments then give you corrupt laws, which further corrupt society.
So
that's pretty negative, isn't it?
But we as Christians can keep declaring the gospel.
Yes.
We can pray.
Yes.
We can pray.
We pray for governments. That's the first thing to do. We're
Yes.
told in 1 Timothy chapter 2 to pray for the governments that we might live a peaceful and quiet life and godly in every way and make the gospel able to be preached in the land. Secondly, we can teach righteousness and truth to children and to the community who will be in the end our politicians. And thirdly, we keep evangelising because the gospel changes hearts. And if enough people's hearts are changed, then society will move in a particular direction. And so we can engage in the political processes as much as they're allow us to.
So we say God's put us in a democracy, and that means God's given us the responsibility of functioning in a democracy to some extent and being part of that community.
All you've got to do in our democracy is vote and obey the law. And if you don't vote, they'll fine you.
But you can take an interest, or you can just say, I'm not going to take an interest.
I don't have to.
Yes.
It's not required of a citizen that they take any interest.
Should Christians?
Take interest?
Yes.
Yes, because we care for people. Yes, because we care for the good of our society around about us. But we've got to be careful not to think that we will bring the kingdom of God in by political activity.
Right.
And so we don't spend all our time on that and not
Right.
preach the gospel. On the other hand, we can't say, oh, well, I just preach the gospel and I don't care about society, because the gospel teaches me to care about society. So although it may not convert a poor man to protect him from the advertising of the alcohol and prostitution and pornography and smoking and
Gambling.
I haven't converted him by doing those things, but his life will be better off.
Yes. He'll live a better life in this world,
And
at
his
least.
children will lead a better life.
Yes.
And society will be a quieter, more peaceful place in which the gospel can be preached more easily.
So there are a lot of things there worth discussing and debating, getting that balance right, keeping the priority of evangelism there, praying for our governments. But we're in a democracy, so what can we do as citizens in a democracy? Things to talk about with your prayer and Bible study group, around the dinner table, whatever. If you'd like to hear more from Phillip Jensen, join us next time on the chat room, but come along to St Andrew's Cathedral.
I'd love to see you anytime.
Love to have visitors, don't we?
Yes, we do.
So if you're in Sydney or visiting Sydney, call into St Andrew's Cathedral, hear Phillip teach, and be sure to join us again next time on the chat room.